Back in the early 2000s, if you used a video camera of any sort, whether it was a home video camera or a professional ENG style rig, it recorded to one type of format: tape. Granted, there were lots of different tape systems in existence, from VHS to SVHS, from Hi8 to Beta SP, and even the earlier U-matic system. Tape-based recording was king, and everyone from corporate video producers through to big television studios and news broadcasters had very established and efficient workflows that dealt with the format. But tape had several issues, despite its longevity. First and foremost, it was linear. In other words, in order to watch back footage or ingest it into the editing system, you had to rewind and forward wind through it. And although many organisations were using non-linear editing systems, transferring the footage mostly involved real-time copying of it to the computer system. Although there were some systems in existence that could ingest it at double speed, but that's a topic for another time. In the field, it was all too easy to commit the cardinal sin of leaving a gap in the footage, breaking the timecode and causing anyone who had to edit it no end of nightmares. On the other hand, tape-based workflows were very well established, and above all, tape was cheap and easy to get hold of. It could hold hours of footage, and it was inexpensive enough to store long term. Not that some news producers didn't find an excuse to commit the other sin of reusing media at times. There was also an abundance of repair shops that could service the tape mechanisms and cameras and replace the parts to keep them going for years. Therefore, breaking the wholly embedded nature of tape-based footage acquisition was always going to be a tough cookie to crack. But in the early 2000s, both Sony and Panasonic decided that now was the time to bring video cameras into the 21st century, and it would lead to one of the major format wars that you've either never heard of or have long since forgotten about. This is the story of how Sony's XDCAM and Panasonic's P2 system completely changed the video camera landscape and dragged the professional video production world kicking and screaming into a whole new way of thinking. And believe me, it got messy at times. I know, because I was right in the centre of it. Yep, that's me on the front cover of a Sony XDCAM brochure, my first and last venture into catalogue modelling. The problem that production had back then was that while non-linear editing was now standard at the time, the cameras that acquired the footage were still linear, causing a bottleneck in production. What was needed were cameras that also acquired footage in file-based form that could be copied over to the editing system in the same way that you copy files from your computer drives. But back in the early 2000s, this wasn't an easy problem to solve. Solid-state media such as flash cards and early SD cards existed, but they were either monumentally expensive or simply not fast or reliable enough for professional video use. The solution that Sony came up with was called Sony Professional Disc. Sony knew that eventually solid-state recording would take over, but until that point, the company deemed that professional disc was the answer. The professional disc effectively looked like a DVD inside a caddy. The system was in fact closer to Blu-ray than DVD, using the same 405nm blue-violet laser, writing data to a track pitch of 32 micrometers. The first discs held 23.3 gigabytes of data and cost just $30 per disc, making the system incredibly cost-effective to run. Sony also claimed at least a 50-year archival life for the discs, making them suitable for medium to long-term storage too, a claim that was met with a lot of suspicion at the time due to people's experiences of writable DVD and CD-ROMs, but more on this later. On the flip side of the coin, Panasonic went all in on solid-state recording with its P2 system. P2 was much faster than XDCAM at transferring footage, but a single 4GB card, the largest available upon the system's launch, cost around $2,000 and could only hold 8 minutes of standard definition DVC Pro 50 footage or 4 minutes of DVC Pro HD when the high-def cameras were launched. This meant that in order to be able to record up to 40 minutes of standard definition DVC Pro 50, you'd need to use all 5 P2 camera slots that were available on the cameras, costing you the princely sum of around $10,000 in P2 cards. You can imagine the cost overhead for news organisations with multiples of cameras in the field. P2 cards were effectively constructed as a RAID array of 4 SD cards inside one casing, and while costs did eventually come down, a 64GB P2 card would still have cost you $2,600 in 2008. But despite the drawbacks of each respective system, both of them had their fans, leading to some occasionally very heated debates on online forums at the time. Not only that, but the two systems were met with a lot of suspicion from professionals who found it hard to let go of the idea of recording to linear tape. Objections to XDCAM ranged from questions over the reliability of the disc mechanism through to the longevity of recordings. As I mentioned previously, writable DVDs and CDs at the time had a terrible reputation for data failure, sometimes even after only a year. And this concern, despite the fact that XDCAM was truly a much more robust system, carried over in some people's minds. Those critical of P2 criticised the price of the cards, and the fact that their cost meant that news stations were often having to copy the data over to their editing systems and then quickly wiping the cards for the next news gathering cycle. A way of working that sent shivers down the spines of any long-term tape user. There was also the question of data integrity. If a P2 card failed, you lost everything. Both systems were also criticised by fans of tape-based workflows because of the number of separate video files that each system created, forcing a rethink about footage organisation. As one of the first people in the UK to own an XDCAM system, I felt at the time that much of the criticism came from a position of spreading fear, uncertainty and doubt. XDCAM was an incredibly well thought out system. The disc writing mechanism was designed to take real punishment, with effective anti-vibration dampening systems and discs that were fully dust sealed, protecting them from the elements. Also, unlike tape, both XDCAM and P2 didn't suffer from moisture issues in humid environments. Sony had also implemented an incredibly robust error correction system too, that could read files even if the disk surface became scratched. In the unlikely event that a disk did become so badly damaged that the camera or drive couldn't read it, Sony even offered a data recovery service that could attempt to extract the data. If power to the camera suddenly stopped mid-recording, the camera could salvage the footage by creating a new footer for the file, making it readable again, a function that notably Panasonic's P2 system lacked. XDCAM also featured a cache record system that originally allowed up to 10 seconds of pre-record, a feature that's often standard on even low-cost devices now. But XDCAM used this for safety of recording as well. If the camera was subject to extreme forces, the device would disengage the disc writing system to avoid damage, cache the footage, and write it to the disc once it could realign the laser head. Contrary to some histories of XDCAM that you might have seen elsewhere, the XDCAM system did not begin with the high-definition half-inch PDW-530 series cameras, which were released to market in 2006. The first XDCAM cameras were the standard definition PDW-510, which recorded to a 25 megabit per second DV cam codec, and the PDW-530, which could record in the 8-bit 50 megabits per second 422 IMX MPEG format. Both of them were released in 2004, 3 years before the first HD models. Strangely, the standard definition PDW-500 series often gets ignored or forgotten when the history of XDCAM is mentioned, often being written off as being too niche or too short-lived, or completely forgotten as a whole. The reality is that the entire XDCAM system was always very niche, even after the half-inch HD cameras were released. But the fact is, it was the 500 series cameras that built the foundations and reputation of the system, and began to change the way that many news organisations around the world operated. In fact, even after the half-inch HD cameras were released, Sony didn't view them as replacements for the standard definition cameras. Much of the world was still to make the move to high-definition acquisition, and certainly not many news organisations in the US were high-def at the time, nor had any immediate plans to be so. Incredible as it might seem, it's often forgotten that back then there was actually a debate about whether HD would ever truly be mainstream. Many stations in the US hadn't even made the move to shooting the 16:9 ratio, so Sony saw the 500 series and the f300 series coexisting for years to come, although in hindsight that was a little bit optimistic. The different sensor sizes meant that the 2/3" PDW-510 and 530 were compatible with existing B4 style zoom lenses, while the 1/2" PDW f330 and f350 required new 1/2" ENG lenses, and although more of them came to market as time went on, there wasn't the same choice available as for the 2/3" models. Standard definition B4 lenses could be adapted, but you lost out on the wide angle of the zoom range, and they weren't designed to resolve HD resolution, so they were less than ideal in those circumstances. In fact, organisations like the BBC, which was very slow to adapt to any tapeless workflows, specifically rejected the 1/2" high-definition XDCAM cameras precisely because of the smaller sensors and comparative noisiness of the image compared to its existing standard definition 2/3" ENG systems. The 1/2" cameras were also limited to recording 35 megabits per second in 8-bit 420 colour with no 422 option. Nevertheless, despite their shortcomings, the f300 series did find a home being used for news and documentary work by broadcasters in New Zealand, as well as European broadcasters like NRK in Norway, WDR in Germany, and TVP in Poland, among others. The f350 was notable for the inclusion of a slow and quick function, which allowed overcranking for slow motion and undercranking for the speeding up of footage on playback. Above 30p the resolution dropped, but to see Vericam style slow motion on such a, inverted commas, affordable camera was a revelation at the time. The standard definition XDCAM professional disc-based cameras were initially sold to news organisations such as CNN and CBS, as well as German broadcasts such as WDR, but the real seismic shift didn't come with the 1/2" 300 series models, but instead with the 2/3" high-definition PDW-700, which was first announced in 2007 and went to market in 2008. The PDW-700 was purchased by major broadcasters such as CCTV in China and Japan's NHK, Al Jazeera, CBC in Canada, and even the BBC, among others. Top Gear famously used both the PDW-700 and the PDW-F800 disc-based cameras, shooting such famous segments as the Arctic Adventure on them. XDCAM and P2 were capable of so many things that tape-based cameras could never do. I could pre-name my files, for example naming them after the scene I was filming. The process to do this was a little convoluted, but it worked. I could even create assembly edits on the camera while out on location, something I did a few times while staying overnight on a shoot. If I wanted to, I could also delete bad takes, although doing so is bad practice. But I could also flag good takes as well, making the files easier to identify later in editing. Significantly, it was possible to immediately review previous shots, something that wasn't as convenient to do on tape-based cameras like the DSR-500. The PDW-500 series cameras were also some of the first ENG-style devices to feature a full-colour flip-out LCD screen on the side of the body. At the time, ENG cameras all featured black and white CRT-based viewfinders. The reason for this was that black and white made focusing easier, particularly with the focus peaking added into the mix. This was fully analog peaking, and in my opinion it was much more effective and easier to see than the type of digital focus peaking that we see now on modern cameras. The side effect of this is that if you owned or operated any ENG camera at the time, you became very good at understanding white balance. This was because until you got back to base and could review the footage on a monitor, you never actually knew if you'd got the correct white balance, or if you'd completely screwed up and got it wrong, or had forgotten to set it at all in the heat of the moment. A colour LCD on the side of the camera was therefore a pretty big deal at the time. By today's standards, it was still pretty awful, but it was a step forward. A big feature for me was that the PDW series of cameras could record progressive scan in progressive segmented frame format. PSF, as it was known, recorded true progressive scan within an interlaced format container, so you generally had to tell your non-linear editing system that the footage was ProScan in order for it to be displayed correctly. At the time, when most ENG cameras could only record newsy-looking interlaced footage, it was again a nice step forward. Although, if you wanted to record 24p on US models, you had to add on the CBK FC01 pull-down board. The PDW-500 series cameras also featured a pre-record cache of up to 10 seconds, a feature that could theoretically be very useful in a news-gathering environment. Later cameras increased the buffer to 30 seconds. XDCAM did have one big Achilles heel, however, and that was the speed at which it could transfer footage from the camera or drive. In theory, it was possible to transfer DV cam files at 5 times real-time speed and IMX50 at 4 times real-time using iLink, or Firewire 400 as it was sometimes otherwise known. In reality, transfer speeds were much slower, often coming up against the bottleneck of hard drive speeds at the time. If you used the later PDW-700 and 800 cameras, transfer speeds could be as low as 1.5 times real-time. By far the fastest way to transfer footage was to use one of the dual laserhead decks, such as the PDW-1500 or the later PDW-U2 and U4 drives with USB 3. But at $13,000 or more, the PDW-1500 was a serious investment and remained in the domain of broadcasters rather than independents and freelancers. It was for this reason that the XDCAM cameras created lower resolution proxy files alongside the full quality footage. Editing systems that had native compatibility with XDCAM could quickly copy the proxy files over so that editing could begin, while the remaining higher resolution files copied over in the background. This also meant that edits could be created in the field on a laptop, since many portable computers at the time weren't often powerful enough to deal with full resolution footage. As the price of solid-state cards came down and smaller, lighter cameras like the XDCAM EX1 and EX3 became available, along with newer shoulder-mounted counterparts like the PMW-500, the disc-based XDCAM cameras were used less and less for news gathering and production overall. But they didn't disappear, often being used for high-end television work and documentary due to the inexpensive nature of the media and the proven robustness of the cameras and disc system. The move to tapeless workflows as a whole received a huge acceleration in 2011 when an earthquake struck Japan, suspending production of XDCAM SR tapes for most of the year. Because a lot of broadcasters at the time relied on XDCAM SR for program mastering, and the demand for tapes was so high, it forced them to rethink their strategy. As a result, many production houses and broadcasters that once had longer-term plans to go tapeless found themselves doing so much sooner than expected, and despite XDCAM SR tape shipments beginning again in October of that year, the writing was on the wall for tape. Sony ended production of tape-based systems in 2016. Speaking from a purely personal viewpoint, I still regard my PDW-510 as one of the best cameras I've ever owned. It never missed a beat. There was the reassuring clunk as the drive mechanism engaged and the sound of it whirring up to speed, and although it was standard definition, I still miss it. Being a fan of the system also led to my video technology writing career and camera reviews, something I've now been doing for over 20 years, as well as travelling around giving seminars about the XDCAM system at the time, although I did get pigeonholed as the XDCAM guy. I can also attest to the longevity of the discs themselves. Fairly recently, I briefly managed to borrow a PDW-U2 drive so that I could see if I could transfer some of my old footage from my many XDCAM discs to my current Mac to experiment with modern upscalers like Topaz. You're looking at some of that footage now from an interview I shot with British touring car champion Matt Neal. Although I had forgotten how slow and clunky the system was compared to modern card-based workflows, all of the data on all of my discs was perfectly intact. They'd sat on a shelf untouched for over 15 years, and because I'd stored my EDLs and various graphics on them alongside the footage, I could, if I wanted to, recreate a lot of my old edits and create remasters of old projects. Working with XDCAM back in the early days wasn't always plain sailing though. I was a very early adopter, and although I provided the occasional bit of footage for broadcasters, the majority of my work was in-house, so I didn't have a great need for compatibility with outside production houses. However, when I did need to interact with broadcasters or third parties, XDCAM could prove to be a real headache, particularly with local news where budgets for upgrading computer and edit systems simply didn't exist. Trying to transfer the footage to the ancient Avid system that one particular newscaster possessed was a real game, eventually requiring the footage to be played and transferred in real time, old school style. And because they didn't have access to an XDCAM drive, I couldn't just hand over the disc. The footage had to be played out from the camera, very professional. Luckily, it was worth the hassle and I provided them with the money shot for that evening's broadcast. But it was disappointing that despite all of the advantages that XDCAM possessed, whenever I did have to work with outside organisations, my beloved non-linear camera ended up being used like a glorified DSR 500, but without the advantage of being able to hand over the media at the end of the day. But thankfully, because most of my work for outside production companies usually involved me shooting with their kit, this wasn't a regular occurrence. Of course, as the years moved on, solid-state recording became more affordable, and the XDCAM system itself moved over to Sony's proprietary S/S cards in the form of the EX series of cameras. The disc-based systems still stuck around for a while though, with their proven reliability record. But the really clever part about Sony's professional disc system is that, contrary to the belief of some, it wasn't just a short-lived interim project while the world waited for the cost of solid-state storage to fall. Right from its initial conception, professional disc always had a roadmap beyond that of just footage acquisition. Despite the move to card recording, Sony knew there would still be a requirement for affordable long-term storage. Certainly, for absolute reliability, the use of archival standard LTO tape is still being used today, but Sony's professional disc system more than proved itself as a medium to long-term storage solution, and as recently as 2024, Sony's optical disc archive system, ironically co-developed by Sony and Panasonic, which can write data to write-once optical disc cartridges of up to 5.5 terabytes in capacity, was being sold as an alternative to LTO. However, while the archive disc media is still being manufactured and sold, Sony has wound down and discontinued the archive drives themselves. Still, for a technology that many thought wouldn't last out the 2000s, a lifespan of over 20 years is pretty good going. XDCAM's disc-based legacy is still an important one. Panasonic's P2 was a system way ahead of its time. XDCAM was a system that showed how practical tapeless systems could be, and it laid the groundwork for the kinds of workflows we take for granted today. Without XDCAM professional disc, I don't think that the conversion and acceptance of tapeless workflows would have been anywhere near as smooth as it was. XDCAM professional disc cameras may well be long gone, but in the mind of this particular camera op, it'll never be forgotten. Thanks for watching.